Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. And welcome to the Leadership Speaker Series that is hosted by the Division of Student Life. My name is Naisha Nixon, and I serve as the Senior Coordinator for Student Leadership Engagement here at Baylor. Student leadership development at Baylor seeks to embolden students towards cultivating the virtues and habits necessary to faithfully and authentically lead for the common good. In support of this mission and through the Leadership Speaker Series, we invite thought leaders to discuss the intersection of their areas of expertise, postures of leadership to include character, virtue, and ethics, as well as human flourishing and the common good. Thank you all for joining us this evening for this evening's Leadership Speaker Series. I would like to take this time now to introduce you to our speaker for this evening, Dr. James K.A. Smith. Dr. Smith is a professor of philosophy at Calvin University, and he serves as the editor-in-chief of Image Journal, a quarterly devoted to art, mystery, and faith. Trained as a philosopher with a focus on contemporary French thought, Smith has expanded on that scholarly platform to become an engaged public, intellectual, and cultural critic. An award-winning author and a widely traveled speaker, he has emerged as a thought leader with a unique gift of translation, building bridges between the academy, society, and the church. He is author of a number of books, which include Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, Desiring the Kingdom, Imagining the Kingdom, How Not to Be Secular, Reading Charles Taylor, You Are What You Love, The Spiritual Power of Habit, Awaiting the King, Reforming Public Theology, On the Road with St. Augustine, The Nicene Option, and Incarnational Phenomenology, and most recently, How to Inhabit Time, Understanding the Past, Facing the Future, Living Faithfully Now. His popular writing has appeared in magazines such as Christianity Today, Christian Century, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, as well as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. Jamie and his wife, Deanna, who is joining him this evening, have 4 adult children and live in the Heritage Hill neighborhood of Grand Rapids, where they attend Sherman Street Christian Reformed Church. Please join me again in welcoming Dr. Jamie Smith before us.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Naisha. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. It's a pleasure to be back at Baylor, where we always experience such warm hospitality. I want to think with you tonight. I hope this title is okay. I didn't check with it. It sounds a little bit like an advertisement for a honeymoon sort of vacation spot. Leadership is for lovers. But I want to think with you about the nature of leadership. Can we maybe... I feel like I'm getting... See, what are we doing wrong? Is it me? Is that okay? I gotcha. Thank you so much. Here's what I want to think with you about tonight. You will lead towards what you want. You will always lead towards what you want, which is why then I think that leadership is fundamentally a question of what we love. Leadership is for lovers. When I say that leadership is fundamentally a question of what we love, I don't just mean that you should be loving. You should be loving. I'm not just talking about being like nice or friendly or compassionate. What I mean is leadership is fundamentally a question of what kind of world do we long for? What kind of vision of the good life, of the common good, of human flourishing are we drawn towards? What kind of world do we want? And leading is ultimately about birthing, catalyzing, and animating love's longings and wants in a community for what God wants for this world, which is the flourishing of all. And so I think one way to maybe picture this is a quote from, some of you know the book, The Little Prince? This is from the author of The Little Prince. And he has this marvelous line where he says, if you want to build a ship, so this is something that you want to accomplish and that you're in charge of, don't drum up people to collect wood, and don't just assign them tasks and work, but rather to teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. If you want to accomplish something collectively, which is kind of the nature of business, of leadership, if you want to accomplish something collectively and lead people in that endeavor, it's not just a matter of having the power to assign tasks. It's not just a matter of giving instructions. It's not just a matter of the task list. It's ultimately a matter of animating longing, teaching people to long for the endless immensity of the sea. This is a famous painting by one of the pre-Raphaelites, Sir John Everett Millet, called The Boyhood of Raleigh. And you might remember that Raleigh went on to become an explorer. And so this picture of the boyhood of Raleigh is the boy who learns to dream of where he wants to go. So I want to think with you tonight about how and why leadership is really a dynamic of what you love and what we are drawing people to love. But I want to inhabit this by thinking through two sort of conflicting principles. Can I just confess for a sec that this sound is driving me crazy? Okay, all right, let's try something for a second. Hang on. Is this any better? Test? That's better? Yeah? Can you all hear me though okay at the back? Who care to? Okay, great. We might be doing a little better. Two principles I want to think through. You are what you love. We're going to think about why you are defined and animated and oriented by your loves and longings, even more than your beliefs and convictions. Don't get too nervous. You are what you love, but you might not love what you think. This is the tension I want us to think through, and then to explore the implications of this for leadership. You are what you love, but you might not love what you think. And the way I want to get at this is by means of exploring a crazy film, or not exploring it, but I'm going to use a visual parable that comes from a movie that almost no one has seen, but that's okay. It's called Stalker, by the Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky. Has anybody seen Stalker? You don't have? I have a free t-shirt for you out there. So here's the setup. You don't have to have seen this. It's a really, really simple setup, but it gets at this tension that we're interested in talking about. There are basically three characters that matter in this film: writer, professor, and this guy called the stalker. I think there's something maybe lost in the translation here. Just think of him as the guide, okay? So we have writer and professor who come to Stalker, and they inhabit this kind of bombed out post-apocalyptic wasteland of a world. Something has gone wrong. We don't know what, but it is a terrible, terrible Cormac McCarthy-like road sort of scenario that's going on. But in this world of the film, this bombed out post-apocalyptic world, writer and professor come to the guide, to Stalker, because he can lead them to a special enchanted space within this world that is called the zone. And the reason why you want to get to the zone is because within the zone is kind of this sanctuary, this holy of holies, this opportunity space that is simply called the room. Okay? Not the most creative names for things, but you see how this works. Why is it that writer and professor want Stalker, the guide, to lead them to the room? Because in the room, you will get exactly what you want. If you're thinking about Harry Potter's Room of Requirement, that's okay. It's not entirely different, but so in this room, you will get exactly what you want. And so a lot of the film is following writer and professor on this arduous trek led by Stalker, by the guide, so that they can finally make it to the zone and they can eventually get to this place where your dreams will be made true. I mean, who wouldn't want to get to the room where you can get exactly what you want? So the room is what has drawn them there. It's what has led them to follow Stalker's promises. For in the room, he tells them, it's this, isn't it? Watch this. Oh, sorry, I was going to get angry with it for a second. Maybe if we can mute that one somehow? Yeah. Oh, it should be muted. Let's do this. Oh. I felt like you made, no, that's my bad. No, it's all good, it's all good. I feel bad for all of you, because you came here expecting such a marvelous experience. You thought this was the room where you would get exactly what you want. Instead, you're getting feedback. So, here's what's fascinating about the story, the episode in this film. After this arduous trek of wanting to get to the room where they will get exactly what they want, just about the moment that they are going to enter, they get cold feet and back off. And you're like, wait a second, what's going on here? Let me read one paragraph of a description of this from a marvelous book about this movie. This is like super geekdom level. There's a book about this obscure movie the book is called Zona by Jeffrey Dyer. It's amazing. Here's his description of the scene. And we're right here. Here's the scene. They are in a big, abandoned, derelict, dark, damp room with what looked like the remains of an enormous chemistry set floating in a puddle in the middle, as if the zone had resulted from some ill-conceived experiment that went horribly wrong. And off to the right, through a large hole in the wall, is a source of light that they're all looking towards. For a long while, no one speaks. The air is full of the chirpy, chirpy, cheep, cheep of bird song. It's the opposite of those places where the sedge has withered from the lake and no birds sing. Here the birds are whistling and chirping and singing like mad. And Stalker tells writer and professor, in a way tells us, that we are now on the very threshold of this room. This is the most important moment in your life, he says. Your innermost wish will be made true right here. Who wants to go first? And both writer and professor won't step in. Well, wait a second. Isn't this the whole point? Isn't this what we went through all of this, is to get to here so you can get exactly what you want? Why wouldn't they step in? Can you imagine? Well, here's the thing. The room will get you exactly what you want, not necessarily what you think you want. So what if the room isn't just now going to confirm your wants? What if the room is going to unveil your wants? And now you step in, now you can see why professor and writer are starting to get a little bit nervous. Because now, maybe this room isn't the place where they actually sort of like have all of their expectations confirmed. Maybe it's going to be this very uncomfortable apocalyptic scenario where they're going to discover something about themselves that they didn't realize. That maybe they don't want what they think. Can you feel the tension between those two things? That's the space that interests me tonight and for thinking through the implications of leadership. If you lead towards what you want and you are what you love, then what's the significance of the fact that you might not love what you think? Everybody with me? Now, what I hope is that a lot of us can identify with this discomfort. Like maybe it dawns on us too when we get to the threshold of this room, or like, I'm not sure if I want to really learn what I really want. And if I ask you, because I think we can identify with the tension, the gap, the disconnect, the misalignment that's being experienced here. Because like, you're all brilliant Baylor University students. And I'm going to assume that a lot of us in the room are also Christians, not necessarily, but many of us will be. And if I ask you, what do you want? Tell me what you want, what you really, really want. If I ask you that question, in a way, you know the answer, right? Like, you know what the right answer is that you're supposed to say. But also, I also believe that you could have the convictions that what you want is what God wants for the world, right? Like, you might say, well, what I want is the shalom of all creation and the flourishing of all things, and I want God, and I want what God wants for the world. And sincerely, honestly, I believe you, I believe myself when I say that that's what I think I want. The question is, do I want to still step into this room? Because could it not be the fact, and are we not all aware of the realities of our own hearts in such a way that we maybe don't feel so competent to step in the room? So here's the question I want to think through. How does it happen that I might not love what I think? Can you feel the tension and misalignment? Well, why would that be the case? Because if I have convictions, if I have beliefs, if I have sort of knowledge about what I want to see, why wouldn't that just immediately line up with my desires and longings and affections and hungers? How could there be this disconnect between head and heart? Well, the human heart is quite an inscrutable thing, is it not? Right? So that there's a sense in which the heart is this kind of mysterious, conflicted core of who we are. It's this interior depth that, well, the prophet Jeremiah says often deceives us. Or when St. Augustine, he's kind of my guy, St. Augustine, says at one point in his Confessions, he's sort of looking inside his own soul and he says, it is terra incognito. It is a foreign country. I don't know myself. I'm an enigma to myself. I don't even know what's going on, roiling in my heart. This is what I think we need to grapple with if we are going to take leadership seriously. I think one of the ways that you talk about leadership here at Baylor is it requires a certain kind of self-consciousness, yes? It requires a kind of intentionality and self-consciousness about your own character, capacities, inclinations, and so on. That's what we're going to sort of diagnose a little bit tonight. We're doing a sort of self-consciousness exercise. And what I think is crucial for us, if we're going to understand why it's uncomfortable for us to step in the room, if we're going to make sense of this misalignment between head and heart, between convictions and longings, I think we cannot possibly have an adequate account or understanding of this if we don't take seriously what I'm going to call the spiritual significance of habit. The spiritual power and significance of habit. Now, why does that make a difference for us? Well, think of it this way. I'm saying you are what you love, and you will lead towards what you want, right? What you long for. Love, in a long-standing, both philosophical and Christian tradition of thought, love is understood as a virtue. In fact, love is understood as really the crowning and organizing virtue of all of the virtues. Well, what does it mean when we say that love is a virtue? Virtue is just an ancient Greek word for a good habit. Virtue is a good habit. So when we say that love is a virtue, what we mean is love is a good habit. Okay, well, what is a good habit? A habit here is not necessarily just the kind of physical repertoire of things that you go through. Do you know what I mean? Like you might see, like you might have a habit of always putting on your left sock first or something. Or you know, some batter in baseball has this whole routine that he has to go through before, right? He has this habit, this ritual. That's actually not what the exterior sort of repertoire of actions, that's not actually what we mean by habit here. A habit instead, when we say that love is a virtue, it's a good habit, what we mean is it is an internal disposition of character. Okay? A habit is a disposition that you acquire such that you are becoming the kind of person for whom this way of being in the world is starting to become second nature for you. When something has become a habit, you no longer have to think about it because it's so woven into the fabric of who you are that now you do it without thinking about it, right? Do you ever use that phrase, oh, that's second nature for her? And when we say that, what we mean is she's the kind of person who could not do that, right? When we're talking about virtues as habits, we're talking about these dispositions, these kind of inclinations, these default ways of being that we learn. We're not talking about biological hardwiring. We're talking about ways of being that over time become so sort of like in our bones, under our skin, woven into the fabric of our being and character, that we become the kind of people for whom this is our default orientation. This is our way of being. Good habits like that we call virtues. What are bad habits? Vices, okay? This is also very, very important. Our disorientations, our disordered loves are also habits. They're not just the fruit of bad choices. It's not just sort of discrete actions. It's because I've become a certain kind of person who wants something else. Often without thinking about it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. How are we doing okay so far, okay? So whenever you hear, say, the biblical tradition use the language of the heart as the center and seat of the human person, this is a way of signaling this point, that you live out a way of life, not just based on what you think through, or even just based on what you choose to do, you live out a way of life that bubbles up from the inclinations and dispositions of your loves, your heart center. How does the author of Proverbs put it? Above all else, guard your heart. Why? Everything you do flows from it. Above all else, guard your heart. Why? Because that is the fount and spring of an entire way of life. So here's what gets interesting, for me at least. All habits, virtues, and therefore all of our loves and longings and desires. You'll notice, by the way, I'm going to use the words love, longing, desire, hunger, yearning. I'm using all of these synonymously, okay? Because we're actually talking, and this is also kind of a biblical intuition, right? Think of the psalmist as a deer pants for the water, right? This picture of love as a kind of hunger, a desire. St. Augustine, in the very first paragraph of his Confessions, famously wrote, it's written in the form of a prayer, he says, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." That's the picture of the kinds of creatures we are. We are animated and oriented by our loves, but our loves are habits. So they have to be formed, trained, inscribed in us. So the key question is, how do I acquire these habits, right? How do I learn these disciplines? You are not born with these kinds of habits of virtue and vice. These are acquired dispositions that we learn. Virtues are caught more than they are taught. So what are the ways that we acquire these kinds of habits of the heart? How do we learn these longings and affections? Well, one way, and an important way, I'm not going to spend as much time on it tonight, but one significant way is through imitation, right? So Aristotle, for example, says if you want to learn how to be just, you look at what a just person does, and then you imitate the just person, and that's your way of kind of learning how to be a just person. So you learn a virtue by means of imitation. You follow an exemplar. Now, by the way, this is also how you learn vice. And every parent is terrified of exactly this dynamic. Because yes, on the one hand, what the hope is your children are learning virtues by imitating you, but you have regular experiences of seeing that they have also learned vice by imitating you, okay? So imitation is one of the ways, is imitation a sort of biblical intuition? Yes. Very much, right? Can you think of passages in Paul's letters, for example, where Paul says, be imitators of me as I imitate Christ, right? Every time you hear imitation language in the New Testament, that's virtue language, okay? So that's one way that we learn these virtues. I'm interested tonight in primarily the second way, which is we learn virtues through practice. We learn virtues, we learn habits generally through practice. And what I would say is learning to love and learning our loves takes practice. What do we mean? Our wants, our longings, our vision for sort of what the good life looks like are caught much more than they are taught. And our loves and longings sort of acquire an orientation based on the rhythms, rituals, and routines that we apprentice ourselves to. So a metaphor, a kind of visual metaphor I want to use here is, think of the human heart like a compass. Okay, so imagine that your heart, your heart, the seat of your longings and loves, is like this compass. But every compass has to be calibrated, right? And in a sense, the way our hearts get aimed and oriented towards some north, or some, in this sense I'm picturing some version of the kingdom, some vision of the good life, is through our participation in rhythms, rituals, and routines that affectively and in many ways incarnationally and viscerally train our hearts to want something. And like every compass, the heart has to be calibrated, pointed towards some north, and the rituals and rhythms and routines that we give ourselves over to are what effectively calibration technologies for our loves. So I want to call, because we're talking about sort of what you ultimately desire, I want to say, let's call these sorts of rhythms and rituals and routines that shape and train our most fundamental loves and longings, I want to call them liturgies. Liturgies with a small L, if it helps not freak you out. Some people have like sort of a visceral negative reaction to the word liturgy. Let's try to not do that tonight. But let me explain why I'm calling it this way. Liturgies are things you do that also do something to you. Okay? They're loaded. Liturgies are practices, things you do that aren't just sort of expressing something that you feel, they are actually training you what to love. And what we have to appreciate, and I think what especially leaders have to appreciate, is that there are liturgies everywhere. We're not talking about just churchy things here, right? Because in fact, there are all kinds of repertoires of rhythms and rituals and routines that are actually bent on training, calibrating your heart to be aimed towards some particular vision of flourishing, some version of what is supposedly the good life. And the reason why, I wonder if now I'm finally answering my own question. How is it that I could get to the room where I could get exactly what I want and then get nervous about going in. Do you see why that might be the case now? Because what if I've been sort of informing my intellect with all the right beliefs, convictions, and sort of knowledge and doctrines, but I didn't realize I was apprenticing my heart to some other version of the good life, some rival vision of flourishing, because I didn't even realize that the things I was doing were doing something to me. In other words, what if I have effectively been seeding or apprenticing my loves and longings to some other story about what the good life is, because I didn't realize that the practices I'm giving myself over to are liturgies? Does that make sense? Can you feel the tension between those two things? So it's almost like what I want us to do is put on a new set of lenses. Let's call them liturgical lenses. That's not super cool, but it's another mode of cultural analysis, if you will. Put on these liturgical lenses and now look at not the religious things you do, look at the everyday things you do. And see what are the rhythms, rituals, and routines that I give myself over to that have been forming me in ways that I might not have realized. This is how the misalignment happens. This is how the disconnect happens. I might be very studious and conscientious about my convictions of what the common good is or what a vision of flourishing is. But if I am sort of unaware of and unattuned to all the ways that my heart is being captured by rival stories, I might not realize that I'm living this kind of bifurcated life. Let me try to give you a couple of examples. Think of this as sort of analyses of cultural liturgies, we're going to call them, okay? One is, I just keep coming back to this because it still feels like a real challenge. So my kids are, like my oldest is 31 years old now. I don't know how that happened. But when he was a teenager, we used to have this kind of insider joke where when he wanted us to take him to the mall, he would come and he would say, "Dad, will you take me to the temple?" You know, you've perfected that mode of like mocking your parents while you're also trying to get them to do something for you. And so it's like, "Will you take me to the temple?" And I know I was being mocked, but it was also a slight parenting win because it shows that he remembered a conversation we had in which I tried to explain to him that Woodland Mall, and where we live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, is not a neutral site. It is a religious site. Now, the mall is not a religious site because it is a theological site. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not, what worries me about the mall is not its beliefs. The last thing the mall wants you doing is like thinking about beliefs. Do you know? It's not like when you walk into the mall, there's the big directory board, and on the other side it says, "Here are 16 fundamental truths." Do you know what I mean? Like, that's not what the mall is doing. So in what way is the mall a religious site? Because it's a liturgical site. Okay, well, why? Let's step back. I think one of the most potent, powerful, perennial, overriding rivals to a biblical vision of flourishing is the gospel of consumerism. Okay? It's just a rampant feature of late modernity. Okay? The gospel of consumerism, in a nutshell, is something like this. Stuff will make you happy. That's a very, very bare bones way of articulating it, but that's the vision. Now, how does that play as a set of ideas? Not great. Do you know what I mean? The gospel of consumerism does not have an apologetics program because there's no way somebody comes up with an argument to try to convince you that stuff will make you happy. It's an insane position to hold. Does that mean there are no consumerists? So how do we get suckered into consumerism? How do we get suckered into living as if stuff will make us happy? Not by convinced intellects, but by recruited hearts, by apprenticed affections. How does that happen? Well, consumerism does not have an apologetics department, but it does have an incredible evangelism program, which is called marketing. And by the way, I'm a little nervous. We're in the business school, and like some thunder and lightning is going. It's complicated. And in some ways, this is a compliment to marketers. It's a compliment to marketers because actually marketers know you are what you love. Marketers know exactly that what governs your being in the world are your desires. And so what does marketing do? It paints a picture and tells a story that holds out a vision of a way of life, and you're like, Liz Lemon, I want to go to there. And it doesn't work by convincing your mind of something true, but by recruiting your affections. How does it do that? Well, you're immersed in litanies of iconography of products and happiness and so on and so forth. And then, I know people say the mall is dead. The mall just became an outdoor lifestyle center. It just morphed. You know what I mean? And there is an entire sort of ritual. You can do a kind of cathedral analysis of the way the liturgical experience of shopping is reinforcing a way of being. Somebody needs to run the analysis of what it means to click on the links in your Instagram feed, but it's the same machine that's working. And the way it does it is not by convincing your intellect, but by recruiting your affections, by calibrating your heart slowly over time so that you thought your convictions told you, I love God and I want what God wants in the world, and your convictions are absolutely sincere and true. You didn't realize, though, that your heart was being apprenticed to stuff. Make sense? That's the way a cultural liturgy works. I'll give you one other example, and then we'll think about some of the implications of this for leadership. I honestly think that only if we have something like this liturgical lens on to look at our experience, will we in this country ever adequately make sense of the realities of racism, and particularly structural and systemic racism. Let me explain. If you think it's all just about beliefs and ideas and doctrines and knowledge, what will happen is you will think about racism primarily as a problem of ideology, which, by the way, is a problem. Racism as an ideology is a problem. But what will happen is if you only think of racism on that register of an ideology, a set of beliefs and convictions, then what can happen is, very truly, lots of people can say, I do not subscribe to that ideology. And that's true. But what if racism is a liturgy, right? What if there are rhythms and routines and repertoires of ritual that we participate in such a way that I'm never asked to say, I think white people are supreme, but actually my heart has been subtly trained for a lifetime to imagine that I am the center of the universe and that the world should revolve around me. Do you see the difference there? At this point, it's not about our intentionality, it's not about your choices, it's not even about your convictions. It's about a question of whether a liturgical environment of culture has been primed in such a way that it is starting to teach me to love my comfort and security over the common good. And I was apprenticed into that, not because somebody sat me down and made me subscribe to an ideology, but just by moving through the world as the, honestly, white, middle-aged man that I am. And what that means is I've had 53 years of education in that direction, that disposition. Make sense? There's a lot more to be said to it, and it's very complicated. All I'm trying to make a pitch for is to say, I think putting on these liturgical lenses, it helps us think about the disorder of our loves in a new way. So let's think about, because I want to get to some time for questions. Let me say a little bit about the implications of this for thinking about leadership, for how we approach leadership, okay? And I want to think about this, first of all, for you who aspire to be leaders, and then what it would mean for you to carry out leadership responsibilities. So the first thing I think we have to say is this: a key facet of being a leader has to be the self-conscious curation of your loves. The curating of your loves. Now, what do I mean by that? We all need to learn how to take what I call a liturgical audit of our lives, right? Find some opportunity. This is an important reflexive practice to engage in regularly, where you find some way to kind of hit the pause button, step back from your life, and now put on these liturgical lenses to look at your everyday life and ask yourself, what are the things I do that now I see are also doing something to me? Take a liturgical audit of your life and ask, what facets of my life have actually been sort of bending my heart to a rival vision of flourishing, so that I have covertly and in some ways almost accidentally found myself leaning in that way. Take a liturgical audit of your life and then intentionally engage in counterformative measures. That now what you have to become is intentional about developing disciplines, practices that are animated and oriented towards the vision of flourishing and the common good that line up with your convictions. Make sense? We're talking about becoming more intentional in the alignment. I'll make just one small pitch here, and we can talk about it. In its best forms, Christian worship is leadership development, insofar as it is supposed to be a narrative recalibration of your loves and longings. That's what's supposed to go on in worship, okay? It's not just an opportunity for you to go express something to God, it's actually an opportunity for you to answer a call in which God is going to do something in you. So I just want to give a little bit of a new frame to think about why there's something at stake in church for the sake of our formation. Last thing I'll say is this: what then does it mean to be a leader if this is true of human beings? Well, a very, very important facet of leadership is to curate environments so that they are primed with rhythms and rituals and routines that are well ordered and calibrate the heart towards the common good. I mean, one way to think about miscalibrated heart habits here is, a heart habit is miscalibrated when it is bent on either self-interest or special interest, right? One of the subtle ways that we can learn to not pursue the common good is by inhabiting stories and rhythms and practices that over time tell me I'm the most important thing, self-interest, or my group's the most important thing, special interest. I think both of those sit in deep tension with the common good. And what we need to think about is, if you become leaders, you are leaders, when you become even more significant leaders, one of the things that will be your responsibility is to shape the ethos of the institutions that you are a part of. Not just its mission and vision statement, not just its sort of beliefs and goals, but to actually shape what Aristotle calls the ethos, the sort of, well, you know what we would say? We would say the vibe of an institution. But what I mean by that is the sort of inchoate spirit of a place that is carried in its rhythms, rituals, and routines. That's what it will be to be a leader, is to create a space where, in fact, the heart is finding its true north in what it was made for, and is leading others to find themselves in that true north as well. That's what we can hope for from well-ordered loves in leadership. I'll stop there. Thank you. Do you have any instructions for Q&A? Or, oh yeah, you're texting them or emailing them or something.
So we're going to put a QR code up here in a moment, or you can just email directly leadership@baylor.edu with questions that you have for Dr. Smith.
Great. And are you going to ask them, or?
My colleague Chelsea is.
Great. Comments, questions, criticisms, worries? Microphone technology advice?
That email for y'all is leadership@baylor.edu.
There we go.
Can y'all hear me a little better this way?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's up on the screen now, leadership@baylor.edu, and we actually already have some if you are ready,
Great, let's do it.
ready to answer a question for us.
Eager.
Somebody's asked, how do I train myself to notice my liturgies more intentionally?
Yeah, that's a great question. This will sound like a slightly ironic answer, which is find a friend. Now, let me explain. I do think that ideally, sort of recognizing the liturgies you're immersed in is a bit like, the proverbial goldfish that doesn't know they're swimming in water, okay? What I find is the liturgies that are probably actually most influencing me are so close to me as to be sort of invisible, right? Like they're almost, right, if I put my hand on my heart here, it actually falls outside of my field of vision. I can't see it, but you can see it. And so I do think that there is a gift in a communal discernment with one another. And I would say one of the gifts of, say, true trust in a real deep friendship and mentorship would be to have comfort and safety with one another to help sort of point out the liturgies that we're immersed in that we might not realize. So in some ways, you can't just do this on your own. You need others to help you, which is, I'm so glad somebody asked that question. I think that's important.
That's awesome. Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in also about how to best go about curating an environment as well.
As leaders.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. So your capacity to curate an environment will be proportional to the amount of agency and authority you have within an institution. Does that make sense? Or is this too abstract? Like I'll tell you, I go and speak to a lot of schools, high schools, classical schools, things like that. And think of it this way. The headmaster or the principal of a school has a kind of capacity, authority, and agency to set up the rhythms school-wide. And some teachers might be inhabiting an institution and wish the principal was doing other things than that principal is doing, but the teachers always at least can shape a classroom, right? So first of all, you need to look for the space in which you have agency and authority to set the vibe. And then what you want to look for are what are routines, practices, disciplines that you can sort of subtly use to frame and prime the way that your community works. I mean, we're doing this so abstractly. It's a little, if we pictured, what if you were like a leader on a team, on a sports team, for example? Do you play sports at Baylor? I haven't heard. I will say that I think a great well to drink from when looking for such ethos-shaping practices are the ancient legacy of spiritual disciplines and the sort of reservoir of the church's liturgies and disciplines. So think of the way in which, it must be because I'm a Calvinist that I always think of confession. There's a historic sort of liturgical practice and discipline of confession and assurance of pardon or absolution and so on. Think of that as the makings of a framework that tells a different story about who we are as humans with one another. It's about reconciliation, it's about forgiveness, it's about humility, it's about honesty of who we are. What would it look like for you to shape the ethos of some team or institution to reflect the sort of wisdom and practice that is carried in confession and assurance of pardon? Now, I think a leader who says sorry, a leader who apologizes, is a powerful thing. That will be something to be imitated. A leader who finds ways to build rhythms of encounter within a team so that we can be honest with one another about our hurts and faults and disrupted relationships. Do you see, now we're talking about not just like, oh, you apologize when you mess up, but you're actually creating an environment where now this happens naturally because it's part of a routine and rhythm and ritual. I'm not sure why that example came to me first, but it's thinking about what are the rituals that can shape your institution or team, what are the rhythms, and what story is carried in those practices. Does that help, you think? I hope so. You're asking good questions.
Yeah, they're flying in. So
Okay,
I'm going to try to get to as many as possible, but y'all have some incredible
I
questions.
will not talk so long and answer.
We have several people asking, hey, what does this look like specifically as a student while I'm in college? How do I intentionally shape those liturgies? And then I can couple this one, have several asking, hey, if I notice bad habits, how do I counteract that intentionally?
Great. So this is, to the first question, this is going to sound like such a dad answer. But honestly, the most easily available recalibration center for you is the body of Christ, is the church. That is, there is something that goes on in our commitment to a community of practice that is defined by rehearsing the story of God reconciling all things to himself, that just being there and even just going through the motions is itself probably the most potently available recalibration technology that's easily accessible to you. I've heard there's a few churches in Texas, right? So this is now we can have a longer conversation about whether and how and to what extent all churches do this, but I don't want to. I want you to still like me. There is also something about. I was having some wonderful conversations with your chaplain and associate chaplain, and hearing about some of the programs for community buildings, prayer, discipline on campus. In some ways, when you are a student at a university like Baylor, you have such an intense availability of rhythms and repertoires and recalibration technologies that you will never have again in your life when you're done, and take advantage of them when you can. When you see the bad habits, first of all, that's the beginning, okay? St. Augustine says the desire for grace is the beginning of grace. So, okay, if I recognize this sort of disoriented, miscalibrated habit in my life, recognition is so key, and don't think that it's some sort of like cold turkey abstention that we're talking about here. Some bad habits come from the fact that you are just called to like inhabit the world. So this is not right. Everything I'm saying is not meant to be a recipe for you to retreat from the world. It's about coming up with countermeasures precisely because you're going to have to inhabit a contested world. I would say that, again, the sense of finding a community you can pursue these disciplines and practices with is so crucial, because otherwise it's going to feel like it's up to your willpower. And I actually think that that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the spiritual life. I think one of the worst lies that we absorb from American sort of rugged individualism is a spiritual disorder in which we think that faith is ultimately about you kind of like having resolve and you like, it's self-mastery. That's actually not the gospel. The gospel says it's grace all the way down, and what I need to do is make myself available to the practices of the Spirit, which are conduits of grace, so that God is speaking grace into me. I'm not earning it or managing it or manufacturing it myself. That's why having a community that is part of this with you, if you want to look for an easy, low-hanging fruit, and we're all coming from different places of faith and different Christian traditions, an easy gateway for thinking about these is observe Lent as a season of intentional fasting of some sort, a kind of season of resistance, and try on that kind of practice in that way. But ideally find a community that is doing that and live that out for a season and get a taste of what that looks like.
Oh, there we go. I think we might have time for one more. We're getting a few questions specifically speaking to the timeline for cultivating or orienting desires and wants. Seems like a pretty lifelong endeavor. So specific question, how do I know when my desires are moving toward the right thing, specifically when it's time to make a decision about jobs, careers, and next steps?
Yeah, that's great. By the way, this is a long lifetime endeavor. And it's a school from which you never graduate. The School of Virtue is a school from which you never graduate. I think that's very, very important because it's a long game. In terms of, I haven't thought of it that way in terms of like how to make decisions. I think what I want to say is I want to give you permission to realize and recognize that our intentions are never pure. I hope that doesn't sound scandalous. It's also a deeply Augustinian idea. Like if you ask Augustine, Augustine is experiencing some vocation and calling, and he does this, and he does it really well, and somebody says, now are you doing that for God, or are you doing that for the accolades? Right? Are you doing that for God, or are you doing that to kind of like be recognized? And Augustine's answer will be, yes. It's always both. It's always mixed. I do think it is incredibly liberating to realize one of the reasons why confession is built into Christian practice is because we don't think we ever achieve purity, but we can achieve a renewed intentionality. And I think that to me, I experience that as a liberating thing, because otherwise you'll always feel like you have to make the perfect decision, which means you will end up making no decisions. And I think that can be quite paralyzing. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Well, could everybody join me one more time in thanking James for being here? Truly, thank you so much. This does wrap our time together. I do want to make everybody aware of a few quick announcements and information. We do have another speaker series event coming up in November, and we'd love to see y'all back here for that event with Eugene Cho. At this time, we will be closing out, but I do want to make you all aware of our website. If you have any questions about our area for student leadership development, the other programs we offer, ways that we can support you in your leadership development, we encourage you to visit our website on the Student Life webpage, Student Leadership Development. As